Well, today I have the pleasure of sitting across from Jendayi, Frazer, who is the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. You're currently a member of the Ibrahim Foundation Board and the president and founder of 50 Ventures,
Yes.
which consults on matters African development. But our interview today is mainly to do with the IIAG for 2017,
Yes.
which was made public on Monday, if I'm not mistaken. So let's start with, there seems to be a slowing down of sorts in terms of the average overall governance on the continent. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Ibrahim Index on African Governance, this last one in 2017, looks at a sort of long perspective. It looks at 10 years, and then, so from 2006 to 2017, and then the last 5 years, 2012 to 2016, essentially. And I think that actually it's a very positive story. Overall governance, there has been increase in governance progress, but yet we have to remain vigilant because there have been slowdowns in certain areas. There are 4 broad categories that are assessed in terms of governance. One is the rule of law and safety and the rule of law. The other is participation in human rights. Then we have sustainable economic opportunity, and then finally human development. Where Africa's done really well is on human development, really looking at health, education, and welfare. Although education, the perception is of Africans, because one of the indicators also looks at perceptions. And many people feel that they're not getting sufficient education for their children. But overall, human development really has been a driver of the governance delivery. The areas that are of great concern are really on the safety and security issues. They actually had gone in decline, but over the last 10 years they were in decline, but over the last 5 years it started to pick up a bit more. I think that on sustainable economic opportunity, there's a bit of concern about the rural sector. So there are areas where we really do need greater vigilance, but yet overall I think it's a very positive story.
Okay. Looking at the Kenyan situation, you mentioned security as one of the indicators, right?
Yes.
As one of the broad categories. Kenya, what do you think Kenya is doing right, for example, in dealing with the Al-Shabaab situation?
Well, it's interesting because in Kenya, national security actually Kenya actually has done very well overall. Let me just start there. Every single indicator, well, not every indicator, but every single category has been positive over the last 5 years. And in the area of national security, over the last 10 years, not so much, but over the last 5 years, definitely a pickup. And so I think that the government has done well in terms of protecting its citizens. There's greater vigilance on the government's part, after the Westlands bombings and others to protect its citizens. I think that the integration within the African Union forces within Somalia has in some ways taken the fight to Somalia so that it's not as much in Kenya. But yet there's always more areas for improvement. One of the areas where Kenya doesn't do as well is on accountability. And that really has to do with issues of corruption. That has to do with public management of funds. That has to do with, just accountability more generally. And so the question is, this is, not necessarily indicated from the index, but my own experience with Kenya is you have to root out corruption within the armed forces, within the police forces, within public officials. That's part of the fight against Al-Shabaab. But overall, I think Kenya has done very well.
I know you co-edited a book on preventing violence.
In elections.
Yes. In Africa.
Yes.
So Kenya finds itself in a very interesting position as we speak, in that the Supreme Court validated President Uhuru Kenyatta's win from October 26th, but it did invalidate the August 8th win. We've had the opposition leader refuse to recognize the October 26th election. What is it that we can borrow from other setups, or what is it that we can do, or what's your advice on how best to deal with the situation?
Well, I think it's very clear that no one should lose their life to be able to exercise their right to vote for their leadership. And it's very unfortunate because the way we code political violence during elections is if one person dies, related to political violence, you're put into that category of having a violent election. And in Kenya, now this recent election is now putting it back in that category again. So that's very unfortunate. But I think that what's very encouraging is that Kenya's institutions are working. The Supreme Court, the courts have made decisions all along this election process, not just about the outcome of the August 8th election, but even before that, there are many different judgments. And when you look at the political debate, people reference the Constitution. And the difference in 2007 and 2008 was no one had confidence in any of the institutions, whether it was the Electoral Commission, the courts, or anything. There was no mediating force. Whereas in this election, the Constitution was the common denominator. And whether you believed that someone was acting according to the Constitution or against the Constitution became the frame for having the debate and the discussion. So I think that's very positive. What Kenya has to be concerned about is that you have to build that inclusive. I think Kenya's institutions are better than they were. The political leadership is political leadership. You know, whenever you're in a hot contest about running a country, it gets nasty. And I don't know anywhere in the world where that isn't the case. But I think that there needs to be a sense of the sort of the national identity question is really what needs to be fundamentally worked on next. You found, and I found, because I was in Kenya throughout this election period, that people were living in two different worlds with two different, very different narratives. You have the same thing in the United States today. And building that cohesion in terms of national identity and common purpose, I think, is probably the next stage. And that's sort of the soft elements of power. That's sort of the, it's hard to define how do you get at that. But I think that's where Kenya needs to go. What is very clear from the index is that countries that are at the very bottom, it assesses 54 countries. The countries that are in the last 10 categories are all countries that have gone through war and civil war. So any talk of succession has to be really thought through very carefully, because no state will allow its territory to break off. And the territorial integrity of a country is fundamental to every government. And so unless it's through some kind of vote of a referendum, then you're only talking about a violent process. And that leads to civil war, and that leads to a descent on the governance index across all categories. Kenya right now is number 13 out of 54 countries. All of the countries that are at the very bottom, from Somalia to South Sudan to Sudan, Eritrea, are all countries that have gone through war.
Okay. You mentioned confidence in the institutions this time around as compared to the 2007-2008 scenario. But there has been a political onslaught on the institutions, on the judiciary, on the IEBC, from both sides of the political divide.
And the institutions are standing up to the politicians. And I think that's the most important thing, because what you want in institutions is that independence and integrity. And the fact of the matter is the respect for the institutions were there because no one could get around them, right? Whether before when the August 8th, the IEBC declared Uhuru Kenyatta the president, Raila Odinga was denouncing the courts and saying he had already been cheated in 2013 and he wasn't going back to the courts this time. So he was denouncing the courts. And Uhuru was saying, if you take a petition, the courts will decide. The rule of law has to be respected. When the judgment was made against Uhuru, then he had an outlash against the courts. And the judgment, he said he respected the rule of law and he respected the courts, but he thought it was a stupid decision, effectively. But that's what politicians do. The point is the institution is respected. That's the most important thing.
Corruption is one of the issues that determine overall governance. You've seen South African President Zuma face corruption allegations time and again. Is that reflected in the index?
It is reflected in the index. Now, the index doesn't pick up particular things, but if you look at South Africa is ranked number 6. It's always been in the very top 10. And that's partly because it has a very diversified and robust economy. It also has strong institutions, its judiciary, et cetera. But when you look in the index, you see that under the accountability measures, South Africa doesn't do so well on corruption. When you look under sustainable economic development and look at public management and business environment, again, you see decreasing, they're decreasing in their scores. And so it does reflect the area of public companies and corporations is in the red for South Africa. And so it is picked up in the index, but again, this is 10 years and then the last 5 years.
Okay.
Yes.
The model of democracy in the Western world, if we look at situations such as Rwanda and Ethiopia, which have previously done very well on the index, they're not progressing quite as fast
Yes.
based on what the numbers show. Do you think that has something to do with the governance issues in those two countries? There was a state of emergency in Ethiopia, and Rwanda, the presidential term limits were extended.
Well, I definitely think that any kind of instability undermines governance and undermines progress. And I'll come back to Rwanda and Ethiopia, but I think Kenya is going to be hit with that. And this index reflects up to 2016, but you're going to see, I would expect a decline in sustainable economic opportunity for Kenya from 2017. It'll probably pick back up again because Kenyan people are industrious and they work hard. But the economy's been hit over this long, extended election cycle. And so certainly in Ethiopia, you have strong, robust economic development, state-directed economic development. But when you have insecurity in a portion of the country, as well as on top of that, drought and other climatic problems that they have recurringly, then yes, you will see a decline. I think that's a normal thing. I don't necessarily think it has to do specifically with the model of governance. I think it has to do with trying to govern a big country, a huge, complex, diverse country, and building that sense of national unity and national identity. They still haven't achieved that. You have your Oromia, you have your Tigrayans, you have your Amharas, and they still have those types of divisions that they haven't yet been able to overcome. And economic progress hasn't led to overcoming that national identity challenge. In Rwanda, I think Rwanda is in the top 10 countries. It's a very small country. I think that the decline is partly a contraction of the economy. It's being picked up in the index. And I think that really Rwanda has to push its neighbors to really embrace the idea of the regional economic bloc and community, because it's always going to be constrained as long as it's dealing with the economy of the size that it has. It needs more people, and it needs bigger markets so that it can really unleash its economic progress. So I'm not so sure that it has to do with, again, the model of governance.
Okay. Sticking with the sustainable economic opportunity, infrastructure falls under that. And Kenya, there's been a lot of debate around the construction of the SGR and questions around borrowing by the current administration, which has been in office for the last 4 years. Is that picked up in the index?
It is in some ways. I would encourage the viewers and the listeners to actually go to the Mo Ibrahim Foundation website and click on the whole book is there, and all of the 100 indices are, you can look at them. But you look in Kenya, you see that there was a deterioration over the last 5 years in fiscal policy. There was challenges in terms of the banks. These are all issues that you have seen in Kenya. There's, again, issues on public corruption. It's picked up in the last 5 years, but I'm saying that in the context of Kenya is one of the only countries in the index of the 54 countries that shows progress on every single category. If you take the big 4 categories, within them there's 14 subcategories. On every one of the subcategories, Kenya is positive. But within those subcategories, there's all of these indices, and you can actually see some of the challenges that Kenya has faced.
Okay. Do you, as a consultant, do you consider it a problem in terms of public borrowing?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't really put much attention into. From not as a consultant, I don't have that perspective, but as a person who fought for Africa getting rid of its debt, and canceling all of that debt, back in 2004 and 5 and 2003. I don't like to see huge public borrowing by African countries. I think that it can constrain, especially delivery on the human development, education and health, because those are, you don't see the return until the person becomes an adult and they become productive. And so when you're borrowing against certain of those types of categories, I think it's a challenge. On the other hand, what is very clear is that economic progress is driven by infrastructural development. You have to have that infrastructural development. So if you're borrowing for the infrastructure, perhaps it's warranted, but I think you have to be careful. Africa's already been in the cycle where it's had too heavy a debt burden.
Okay. You mentioned development, which is education, welfare, and health. You steered PEPFAR under the George Bush administration, and Kenya the other day got one of the biggest allocations from the fund. Do you have concerns around the use of the funds? I know that the Kenyan Ministry of Health has had some problems of late on that front. Well,
certainly we have to have concern, because the PEPFAR programs and all of our health programs are coming from the American taxpayer, right? And we have to be guardians of that money. So that's one. And secondly, it's going to help people with their lives. And so it's so important to actually that it's, the delivery happens for the purposes of the funds. Typically, PEPFAR is very tight. It's very difficult to cheat, or to steal money from PEPFAR by the way in which we disperse it. So it's very difficult. I think that the challenge isn't individual. There are going to be corrupt individuals everywhere in the world. It's putting the systems in place to be able to capture them, to be able to discover them and then hold them accountable. And so I think that that's the most important thing. And to the extent that there was a problem within the Ministry of Health, it was discovered, right, through an auditing process. It was then politicized, which is unfortunate. I really do think it's a matter of getting those systems in place to be able to track public funds and make sure that they're being used according to the way in which they're supposed to.
There's a category of participation and human rights, and the civil society space under that. Do you think it's shrinking continent-wide and in Kenya?
Yes, if you look at the last 10 years and then 5 years, participation is better, which is strange because participation is higher, but yet civil society across the continent, according to the index, seems to be shrinking. And so there is, we do need to uncover what does that really reflect, what's going on. Is that about laws that are tightening up registration on civil society groups? Is that about preventing foreign donors to provide money to civil society groups? You see that in Ethiopia and other places. Is that a trend that's happening, and what impact does that have on governance and on participation? So whereas participation is okay, civil society as an indicator within it clearly shows a decline. Okay.
Do you think governments are warranted in their concern around the activities of civil society organizations?
I don't think so. I understand why they would be, but really there's enough space, right? The idea is to create more space. It's not to shrink space. I mean, if a government is confident in its delivery to its population, I don't see why it should be so concerned about the activities of civil society groups.
Okay, but do you think maybe the civil society groups need to adapt to the changing environment?
Well, one of the things Ibrahim says all the time is that the problem is when you have civil society groups that are really political parties in the disguise of civil society groups. They make it bad for all other civil society groups and governance groups. And so I think that, trying to make sure that if you're civil society, you're really civil society. You're not actually a political party, or you're not attached to a political party actually engaging in politics, but you're actually doing something about trying to ensure space and voice and participation and delivery of services or whatever your mandate may be, but not disguising yourself as a political party. I think that's part of the problem. Absolutely, civil society should be vigilant, right? Civil society has to keep space for freedom of association, freedom of speech. Civil society is key to democratic progress. And so I think civil society organizations need to stay strong need to maintain their integrity and their independence from all political parties, and from the state for that matter, and serve that, that creating that space for citizens to engage and to be part of the progress of their country. Yes.
With this past election, yes, the August 8th election and also this October 26th election, the international community and observers from abroad who came to Kenya got a lot of criticism around the way the comments made around the election. The opposition said they just were keen to rubber stamp a process that was not necessarily legitimate, but then again, they're always accused of meddling when they don't see things that are necessarily pleasing to those in the political class. How would you advise them, having served as a diplomat, to tread the waters of the current political environment?
It's not easy. I have to say that, they are doing their job, which is to go out and observe. That's sort of normal here. And certainly in America, when we had our elections, we had observers from all over the world come to our country as well. The difference is they don't have as much voice in our country. Whereas in many African countries, these external observers, I myself have been an observer, have quite a lot of voice. And maybe that's the problem, but I would say that they just have to do their job, observe what they can, be honest about what they believe are the problems and what the event, what has gone well. I don't think that the flack that the observers got was fair, quite frankly. I think it was unfair. I think that if they had, because no matter what you did, one side was going to be unhappy with what you did. So you just have to do your job. And so I think that they did their job fairly and they got the flack that they got, but they shouldn't be discouraged from coming back and being supportive because people see this role as an important one in African countries. I'm not convinced myself. I think domestic observers are more important. They're there longer. If they're not politicized, right? If civil society is not politicized, then I think that really is the development of the democratic progress and the democratic track record that a country needs. Not having external people come in, but for the time being that happens. And so they just need to continue to do their job and do it as best they can.
Mo stressed the words vigilance.
Yes.
Is that what should be your takeaway?
Yes, I think so. I really do think so. We've seen the beauty of the Ibrahim Index for African Governance is that it is so comprehensive. Right? And so for the first time, typically when we look at Africa, it's through the headlines. And we get our impression about what's going on the continent by those headlines. And it's normally the headlines are on basket cases or problematic countries or, crises. But what we see, like looking at the last 10 years, looking at the last 5 years, is that many, many countries, the majority of the countries are actually doing very well. 40 of the 54 countries are doing positive in terms of governance. Now, vigilance is to make sure that we continue that progress, that we recognize where they're faulting, and then put more emphasis in that area. Like, for instance, the rural sector. What's going on in the rural sector that the index is showing that there's a real problem there from a sustainable economic opportunity perspective? That means that there's probably needs to be more infrastructure, there needs to be more job creation in the rural sector so everybody's not crowding into the cities. And so I think that it's vigilance. It's good to have an index that's so comprehensive, and it gives tools to African citizens to hold their governments accountable, and also to hold themselves accountable.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.